Shiva.
Yes.
The next speaker is
yeah.
Shiva Tohidi, and she's speaking on Iranian medical modernity, from Miasma to Germ theory.
In a global context.
Everything that you do is global.
Yeah. So can we have this? We can even make this completely done, I guess.
Just
Okay, so how could I move my? So this one, right?
Yeah. Or just a click.
So which one? Which one? Okay, hopefully it's gonna work. Okay, so I am going to convince you, fingers crossed, in 12 minutes, Professor, not 10.
Okay.
Why the plausible message we all hear to the point of internalization that adoption of modern medicine in regions like Iran was resistance and slow, and in general, that it was backward. Well, my argument in short, very short, is that as long as medicine existed, there were always multiple theories that coexisted and confronted each other. This is inherent in the progress of medicine, and in general, progress in medicine is also very slow. The timeline of my story is during the Nasiri period, because it's the period of what I call epistemological Big Bang of medicine. It's the time of Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, and John Snow. No, my research looks at this period. So don't complain about my research that is about poop. Anton Chekhov said there is a great deal that is interesting on cholera. So if it's good for him, it's good for me. So in the beginning of the 19th century, and cholera traveling all around the world very rapidly, starts in India, it goes through Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, and goes through the Ottoman Empire, sometimes directly even goes to Europe. In matter of less than 30 years, it even reaches Canada. So why is that? It's because railroads are there, steep ships, there's an increase in trade, but ships doesn't just take silk with them, they also take microbes. So there's this globalization that's going on. And because of this globalization, finding how cholera spreads become a global venture in scientific circles. So how medicine marketplace looked like in the 19th century. Up to this point, the basis of understanding medicine and therapies are based on humoral medicine, or Galenic, or for Iranian Abyssinian medicine. But physicians also knew that the ailments are because of certain agents. They were called them invisible particle cells. And you see them in treaties, in Iranian treaties and in everywhere. But they weren't known as living microorganisms, but some agent. Now, this agent needs to move from person to make you sick. What were the theories about how this invisible particle moves? One dominant notion is miasma. What is miasma? It's the notion that emanation from decaying matter creates this bad air, clouds. And these clouds, or noxious air, they move. When they move, they take the sickness from one person to the next town, next city, next country, and over the borders to other continents. What are the other theories? We can't ignore John Snow. He was an English physician who challenged the miasma theory. He basically mapped cholera cases during an epidemic in London, and he pinpointed the people who got cholera on the map. And then he found a cluster of people who were infected around this certain pump in Broad Street. So at this moment, he came to the conclusion that, okay, cholera is not actually transferred through air, it's a waterborne. So now at this point, we have miasma and we have waterborne. But did it change anything? Actually not when you look closely, because it's famous that after John Snow, everything changed. And it didn't. Actually, people ignored him. In scientific circles, his method, because it was epistemological, it was a field research. So they said, oh, it's not even scientific. They called it popular science. So he was ignored actually for a few decades. And when London changes its distribution of water, it's not because of his work, actually. It's because of the rise of middle class and because of the miasma group theory. Because they were saying, okay, you say it's a poison in water. How could this poison from Thames River get to London and it doesn't get diluted enough? So they say it's this dirty neighborhood and this dirt create miasma and then pollute this water. So what else? Now, it's at the moment of the Big Bang. It's 1884. Actually, the credit of isolating the culprit of cholera, Vibrio cholerae, goes to Robert Koch. It's a German chemist. But in fact, it was discovered by an Italian doctor, Pacini, in 1854. Again, no one listened to him at the time. And as you can see in this newspaper, it's 1942, like 100 years after he discovered the bacteria, that he got some credit. Now, people listened a little bit more to Robert Koch, but even Robert Koch didn't listen to himself. He didn't convince himself very much because he came up also after the discovery of this, he came up with this formulation, scientific formulation. It's called Koch's postulate. One of them, it says that if you have to find this microorganism that he isolated, the germ, in people who are sick, and you should not find it in people who are not sick. But when they were testing the people, they could find the agent in people who were not sick. And he couldn't answer why. So even his own postulate sort of refutes his own theory. Okay. So now, it's just a sample. Now I'm going to Iran here. What is happening in Iran? I'm a little bit lost in my paper. So this is just an example of a Persian medical treaty, and I just put this here so that you get a sense of how they actually look like. Now, I tell you with confidence, because I explored these treaties, that there are lots of examples of humoral medicine therapy. It's about therapy. It's not about the reasons of why these illnesses spread. But for instance, in 1854, Abdul Karim Muhammad writes, and you have to bear with me here, it's a bit long. He gives you the instruction of this humoral concoction that is good for, I think, Parkinson or twitch. He says, and here is the syrup, that if the patient desires improvements, this instruction should be followed. Begin by mixing both female and male oud flowers, combining them with rose water, gula, allowing them to soak overnight. The next day, thoroughly sift the mixture and add candy cane, nabat, for touch of sweetness. Now bear with me, it's not finished. Boil the mixture until it thickens, then let it cool. Finally, add 2 mescals of some other thing and as much gold and silver something as desired. Those are the parts I couldn't read. And this remedy is good for Parkinson. Now, you think that this is all that? No. I came also across many, many more treatises and examples that discusses the latest and the best ideas and debates of Europe. Most preventative medicines are based on miasma theory, as well as the Snow's waterborne theory and germ theory. This one in particular is about miasma and predisposition of the person, which in Europe at this point is the most popular, most accepted through in scientific circles, and called contingent contagiousness. And this one says, Vaba cholera is a kind of infection that poisons airs and moves and gets the predisposed people sick. This is another example of a treaty specifically written for cholera. These pages are about its symptoms, and it's because it's a chart, I thought you would get a sense of how these treaties look like, because it doesn't need that much language. But Dr. Afshar, who wrote this, says, if in the outer skirts, the city of one's residence, there existed moods and gutters that would collect water, they have to be kept clean and empty of garbage. Do not wash in these waters and keep the water supply clean. Now, briefing here, it goes on, and it's actually very impressive. And this is just another example that discusses miasma and germ theory. Now, you might ask me at this point that why these Iranians mix and match all these theories and do not respect these great men of science. Now, because in Europe, all the theories are mixed and match. Now, I give you just one example, and that's the greatest stink of Paris. And yes, you heard me right. It's the greatest thing in Paris, 1880, actually. It goes for a few years, I guess. So it's in 80s, and it's this bad smell filling Paris. French being French, they rioted. They get out because they wanted to know what's the origin, and they had the right because they are worried about miasma. They think that this odor might get them sick. Louis Pasteur, being a member of the commission investigating this greatest thing, concluded in his reports that the odors can actually pose a danger to public health. His conclusion was based on a study that he did on a farm outside Paris, that studied sheep dying from anthrax. And he said that this certain sheep that died on this hill in this farm, it was because the sheep sniffed the ground that another sheep who died from anthrax was buried there 12 years before. So he doesn't say graze. So you would think, how did he even know that maybe the sheep grazed, which means contact and which means ingestion? But he says a sniff. And he basically, by announcing this, give credit again to miasma. Now, this is interesting because a year before, anthrax microbe was discovered by Koch, his other father of the germ theory, and they were actually working very closely, and he approved of that discovery. A few months before this report is published, anthrax vaccine is also developed. So it's really mind-boggling. So there are lots of Pasteur apologists who actually interpret in some way, but I just say that at this point, these theories are young, and these people also didn't have the confidence to rely on them. So
is that why Iranians refer to Paris as Paris Bougandu?
It could possibly. Actually, I found a lot of newspapers, French newspapers, that going through this thing, and it's possible, or maybe that's the perfume, French perfume. Explain that. So, in short, in the world of medical epistemology, there were multiple theories and practices that they were competing with each other at the same time. I saw enough Persian primary sources that were engaged with the latest but multiple sciences in Europe. None of these big names and big events created watershed moments when you look closely. In short, it took a great deal of time, a great deal of alliance and confrontation to eventually come to the conclusion that not everything that stinks kills, and not everything that kills stinks.
Very good. Thank you much, Shiva. They're out of time, but maybe a couple of questions. Please, don't hold back. Anyone? No? Oh, yes. Jane, please. Professor Lewison.
You're muted.
You're mute. Yes, please. Jane, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I wanted to ask about the theories of Florence Nightingale, because I know they featured very heavily at Ellis Island and were responsible for the fact that there was such a low mortality rate at Ellis Island, which was the immigration port in New York. And I'm wondering if they had any influence or impact on Iran and her, theories of sanitation and fresh air and these kinds of things. Did you see any effect of Florence Nightingale's theories in the Iranian literature?
No, not really. No, I'm not sure. But it's interesting that you brought that up, because I also came across the last cholera in Italy. Apparently it was in 1920s, and they were going through, and it's the time of immigration. And a lot of Italians lived because of the cholera as well. And they actually, Italian government and the US government tried to not disclose that. And lots of them go through New York, and they brought that with them to the US. So I'm not sure that, I think the time frame maybe of the time you're talking about is before
Ellis Island opens in about 1885. Before
yes.
went to Castle Cork, which was actually on the mainland of Manhattan, and then they brought it to Ellis Island in the 1880s.
Yeah.
So it is a late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah, but as far as I know, that there's this point in time in the early 20s that there were actually lots of sicknesses goes through. I know that they were doing a lot of apparently. They were very tough at the border, but so many of these people didn't show any symptoms, and they could get out, and they would take the cholera to the US.
So they probably had quarantine.
They had quarantine, and they were very tough, but as I said, some of them weren't sick, or they didn't show any sickness, and they did transfer the sickness through Ellis Island.
Thank you very much. The next presentation is by Rachel Lucas, who is speaking on a genealogy of gender reassignment surgery. Rachel.
Thank you. Hello. How do I emailed my slides to the identities and experiences of non-heteronormative individuals, and by also avoiding discrediting or looking at their history. And so Najma Badi uses the term sex reassignment surgery, SRS, but this is also an offensive term because it implies that their identity is not confirmed until surgical intervention. And so I avoided it using in my title, but there will be instances where terms that are considered outdated are used with the importance of historical accuracy, and also because there's no distinction between gender and sex in Persian. Oh, how do I? Okay, so the theoretical framework that I'm stemming from is from Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics from the history of sexuality. So biopolitics refers to how governmental power operates through the management and regulation of a population's bodies and lives. So this encompasses the regulation of health, reproduction, sexuality, and is exerted through practices like surveillance, healthcare, policies, gender-based laws, and other things. And I'm also going to be bringing up Joseph Massad's Desiring Arabs. And he brings up the idea of the Gay International, which is the discourse among mostly white male gay scholars, which has ascribed conceptions of non-normativity to places where they do not belong, which in turn represses some same-sex desires and practices that refuse to be assimilated into its sexual epistemology. I'd also like to bring up that Massad is, in fact, controversial, but I do really value the idea of the importance of cultural context. And something that he talks a lot about is this use of Western activists to base their efforts upon liberating the gays of the Middle East, something that we talk about when it comes to terms like pinkwashing. So for gender identity, starting from the Qajar era, we have the importance of umrads, which are men without beards. And so their subsequent disappearance in Iranian society was influenced significantly by European interactions and the resulting pressure to conform to heteronormative standards. And so Iranian modernist intellectuals often mark that this shift from the heterosocialization to the homosocialization of public spaces is where the start of the unnatural desire or the desire of the same sex stems from. So with the beginning of SRS, we see earlier conceptions associated much with intersex surgeries from medical and news reports that started to include accounts from Europe and the United States. And as more reports came into circulation, transsexual bodies, which were associated with yet distinct from intersex bodies, entered the discourse. So an important figure is Dr. Jahanshah Salih, who recommended that physicians take into account not only their diagnostic physical criteria, but also their social circumstances. And also to withhold medical information to ensure that a patient's marital life is not disturbed. And so Dr. Salih and many other intellectuals at this time were heavily influenced by the American Psychiatrics Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a publication that has constantly come under fire because of its pathologization of homosexuality, which didn't end up being taken out until the DSM-5 was published in 2013. So then in the mid-20th century, we start to see published accounts of trans and intersex individuals. And this was framed around their inability to consummate marriage, which is seen necessary for the success of marriage, family, in the Iranian state. And then in the 1950s, news publications began to include positive humor, which was in contrast to the negative humor that was associated with stories of same-sex practices. So it shows that at this time, SRS was still a morally safe topic. And so in the 1970s, the reputation of SRS began to dwindle because of the emerging dominance of behavioral psychosexology, which is a science that speaks of sexual matters generally. And it has several branches like psychology and criminology. And then the Medical Council of Iran, MCI, began to discuss the ethics of sex change. And they declared that in 1976, except in intersex cases, SRS is unacceptable and must be declared illegal. And so the impact of psychosexology was this idea between the interaction between popular discourse and media and specialized academic knowledge. And this fostered an exchange of ideas. And so sexologists also, they argued that the changing of sex was not due to physiological factors, but rather linked to unnatural psychological traits and corrupt moral behavior. And so they also had an idea that male and female hormones were present in all individuals, and that there was an occasional display of same-sex desire. And then when they reach puberty, this is where that same-sex desire stems from other psychological factors. And so this resulted in a shift of a condemnation and really emphasizing that transsexuality was an indication of sexual deviation. And they also had an emphasis on the moral imperative for parents to educate their children with correct sexual knowledge. Oh. Okay. And so psychosexology converged with modern conceptions to the penal and criminal justice system. And this was prior to the revolution, and it also culminated in the institutionalization of the Legal Medicine Organization of Iran, which today also oversees the current SRS procedures. And so during the 70s, this is where this effort to distinguish true homosexuals from transient homosexuals comes. And this is particularly concerning the filtering process of SRS, which I will discuss later. And at the time, part of the demonization of homosexuality comes from its association with West-toxification and excessive liberty related to the Shah. So one of the most important figures of the trans activist movement is Maryam Khatun Muqara. And so she's a trans woman, and her correspondence with Ayatollah Khomeini resulted in a 1987 fatwa that allows trans women in Iran to pursue SRS and live according to their gender identity until then they can afford to pursue surgery. She did not end up pursuing it until 2002 due to moral purification efforts of the Islamic Republic in the 80s. But at the same time, even though this fatwa came and created changes, there were still, during the 80s, there were times of accounts of humiliation, assault, and rape due to the categorical bifurcation. The categorical bifurcation of gay and transsexual. And so Najmabadi argues that being transsexual rather than gay emerged as a more socially acceptable way of being a non-heteronormative male. And so post-1987, this fatwa did not result in a universal acceptance of trans women. In fact, it heightened attention on the legality, which meant that official documents were under increased scrutiny. So this includes things like their recommendation letter. It includes photos that are as evidence of gender issues during their childhood. And so this is what they, even today, it's a routine practice to prevent detention and humiliation. And so now I'm going to talk about the importance of biopolitics as it relates to this. During this time period, the medical field was forced to comply with the Islamic regime, particularly on Islamic treatises on medicine. And so because of that, there was the establishment of the High Council of Compliance of Medical Matters. And at this conference, papers on abortion, infertility treatments, family planning, contraception, and surrogate motherhood were provided. And so something else that Najmabadi also really talks about is this importance of local trans activism. And so in the 1990s, obviously, the transsexuality had become separate from homosexuality. And so this was due to the lobbying of them, but it's also because of the power that Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa had in comparison to rulings by Ayatollah Khomeini. And so another really important aspect that local trans activism was able to accomplish was the passage, in reference to the passage of the Universal Health Services Act, which then provided coverage to trans individuals. And it also resulted in the exception of trans individuals from mandatory conscription into the army. And so here, this is a kind of a loud photo, but this is referring to this isn't from me, this is from Najmabadi. This is the filtering process. So as you can see, it's very intricate and there's a lot of steps. So it's a 4 to 6 month period of psychotherapy, hormonal and chromosomal tests. And this is so that they can figure out if you're really transsexual, really homosexual, intersex, or you have some other sort of classified psychological disorders. And so the commission at the Tehran Psychiatric Institute makes this diagnostic recommendation to the legal medicine organization of Iran. And that's where you have the final decision on one's status as a transsexual. So how many minutes?
Out of time?
Oh, okay. Oh, that's it. Yeah.
We are out of time, but we can entertain a couple of questions. Yes, please.
So obviously you're focusing on Iran in this context.
Mhm.
So I get if you don't maybe have an answer to this, but do you know how the sort of trans discourse, how it differs from other Middle Eastern countries? Especially
Yeah.
in countries like Lebanon or Iraq, who also have large
Mhm.
Shia populations.
Yeah. Yeah, so Joseph Masad actually talks about this a decent amount, and he specifically is bringing up the idea of homosexuals in Egypt and how the shift from these concepts of by applying a concept of the white male European concept of homosexuality to places that already had same-sex practices, they are then endangering their lives. And so it's while you can compare it because of Iran's specific history with gender identity, it certainly differs, but at the same time, like it is something that is worth consideration in terms of how it relates to like pink washing and other things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again. The next paper is by Helia Karami, and she will be speaking on Shahr-i as a heterotopic dystopia. All right.
Thank you. So my paper is on Shahr-i as a heterotopic dystopia. And this is just like a brief overview of what this presentation will entail. And so what I essentially argue within my research paper is that, actually, sorry, I was going to start off with an introduction to Shahr-i. So Shahr-i, or the Citadel of Shahr-i, was Tehran's functioning red light district for 60 years. And it began to emerge in 1922 as the Qajar's dynasty was beginning to decline, and it was destroyed during the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And so the central argument of this paper is essentially that Shahr-i was an outcome of the modern patriarchal construction of Iran, resulting in the establishment of a functional heterotopic dystopia in the Citadel. And then so there would be like two folds to this paper. One is, how does Shahr-i function as a heterotopia? And that has been through the institution of prostitution exclusively designed for male clientele, through which women were subordinated to male customers with little consequences for the male customers. And the other fold would be the dystopian aspect of it, which is for the residents of the Citadel, specifically the female prostitutes who resided within this state of exception, and how were they exploited by this idea of like patriarchal modernity. And so basically, when Iran was beginning to become modernist, these modernist efforts were imbued with ideas of patriarchal objectives. And because of this, and this was intended so that they could reform the image of Iran as a modern state. And so Shahr-i becomes this domain of exclusivity for the realization of men's desire. And so in order to investigate how does the female prostitute comes into this, is for us to see how does she transform from this in terms of her statutory position in the Safavid area all the way into the Pahlavi area. And so the first concept is that within the Safavid period, prostitutes were considered in high regard because of their performative skills as musicians and artists. And there were even like European travelogues that actually said of how successful these women were, especially also due to the fact that in terms of like their income, they had more of an income than male performers because they were allowed to perform in both female and male ceremonies, while male performers were only limited to male ceremonies. In contrast, when we go into the Qajar period, female performers were limited to the Andarun, which was a specific location only designated for females within the house. And because of this, their status kind of declined, but these women still could live a somewhat prosperous life through the existence of like Qajar harems. And so I looked at the diaries of Zahra Khanum, who was actually a woman who lived within one of these harems, and what she described was that these women never really understood what suffering was, because their like problems within life was like choosing what type of clothes they wear, what jewelries they wear, and how could they serve like the Qajar kings better. However, this changes with the emergence of Reza Shah as the king of Iran, because he ends up eliminating the harems because he saw it as a barrier to Iran's modernity. And one of the actions that he did was that he actually cut the pensions of these women and deported them to Qazvin Gate, which was within a neighborhood called the Qajar Quarter. And so this part of the neighborhood would later on become reconstructed, and this space would transmigrate into becoming Shahr-i. And so what are the implications of this? And so this allowed prostitution to come into the public sphere, because prior to that, within the Qajar and Safavid periods, the sexual access to prostitutes was within this private sphere and limited to only elite figures such as like kings. And so now prostitution has not only come within the public sphere, but it's also become a capitalist enterprise. In this regard, Shahr-i becomes an outcome of the modern patriarchy, as prostitution becomes a key component of patriarchal capitalism. And so in this regard, the woman's body becomes commodified in order to satisfy the sexual appetites and desires of these male clienteles. And so here we have the establishment of the patriarchal right, which allows these men to practice in Shahr-i by being able to easily and readily purchase prostitutes. And so another aspect of like modernist policies that comes into Iran that has consequences for the figure of the prostitute is the sexual reordering of Iranian society. So the Pahlavi government actually reorganized Iranian society. Prior to that, within the Qajar period, male-male relationships were common. There was the existence of the Amrad, who was this adolescent a boy without a beard. However, again, Reza Shah emphasizes this need for like a heteronormative society in order for Iran to be perceived as modern. And so because of this, this results in the elimination of the Amrad and its categorization as being part of the pre-modern Iran. And so here the nature of the patriarchal capitalist system within Shahr-i becomes one in which it provides sex services to solely male clientele, because now the state of Iran actually promoted for men who were zanbas to come in and to interact with women within Shahr-i, but at the same time they scrutinized and they arrested men who were eager to practice homosexuality. Also, another point in regards to this is that women and children were barred from entering Shahr-i, and so we can see how this site becomes more of a patriarchal, commercialized district. And so because heteronormative practices become the norm within Iranian society, the clientele of Shahr-i being only for men, this results in the prostitute within Iran being only associated with the figure of the woman. And so the female body becomes the exclusive site for prostitution within the consciousness of the Iranian people. And so this notion allowed for male clientele to dominantly relieve themselves from scrutiny over engaging in sexual relations with women from Shahr-i, because the patriarchal modernity allowed for the establishment of sex to be seen as a patriarchal right. And so therefore here, the problem of prostitution becomes the problem of the existence of these women. And so since it was these women who were providing men with the opportunity to engage in sexual relations with them, and so thus these were the individuals who bared the brunt of societal scrutiny rather than the male clientele. As we move along forward, there are other problems that come up, and so that the state tries to solve, not for the female prostitutes within Iran, but rather for the prosperity of the male clientele. Here I have an example from Hakim Elahi's book, which was published in 1948, and it's called and be Shahr-i بیایید, or Come With Me to Shahr-i. And here he essentially describes the army division that was the Imperial Army Division that was really close to Shahr-i. And here he showcases that a lot of these army men, who consisted of like healthy and innocent young men, would go into Shahr-i. And so by acquainting themselves with the residences, they would become infected with sexual transmitted diseases such as like syphilis, gonorrhea, and Shahr-i. And then these men would return back to their villages, and they would end up infecting like their close family members. And so here, Hakim Elahi actually points out to one of the key problems that the modern Iranian state was facing within the 20th century, which was the widespread epidemic of venereal diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea. So in this regard, now the modern state is like, we need to adopt new governance policies that will allow us to construct healthy bodies amongst our citizens. And so here it brings Shahr-i into almost the forefront, because it becomes one of the key realms that medical governance needs to be applied to, because they saw the female prostitute as being the vector of these venereal diseases and contributing to the spread of illnesses amongst the citizens of Iran. And so in this regard, the body of the prostitute becomes the most vulnerable against venereal disease microbes, and for them, the prostitute figure becomes the antithesis of the healthy Iranian citizen. And so here doctors emphasize the importance of like implementing regulation within Shahr-i, and this takes on the form of like them providing these women with like health cards, which they had to go weekly in order to update them. They had to have blood tests done every 6 months, and there was sort of like this medical surveillance. However, there is this important distinguish to make, that these medical governance within Shahr-i was to ensure that the state was caring for the health of its actual citizens, which were the male clientele, which were going into Shahr-i and engaging with these women, rather than for these prostitutes. Although I will emphasize that this framework does change within the 1950s and 60s, as the governance policy of the state becomes more of a humanitarian governance. And so the final part of like seeing Shahr-i as a heterotopia comes through the memories that are present from the Great Persian Empire, Great Persian Famine, and how does that interlink with this idea of establishing the prostitute as the other, and I will expand on that. So from 1917 to 1919, Iran lost about 30 to 50% of its population because of starvation. And this was caused by an artificial famine because of the interference of foreign forces that came into Iran during World War I. And these forces consisted of the Ottomans, the British, and the Russians. And so what these foreign occupying forces did was that they ended up taking all of the food that the people of Iran needed, and this resulted in a lot of them experiencing hunger and starvation. And so this created this distaste and fear over foreigners coming into Iran and sort of like taking away what was essentially the right of Iranians. And so the implications of this distaste towards foreign forces resulted in the othering of the prostitute and helped establish Shahr-i as a landscape for unwanted individuals. This is because within the post-World War II context, what ended up happening was there was a major concern for Iran to preserve its national and territorial sovereignty against British and Russian interventions. And so also there was the fact that many individuals who had experienced the Great Persian Famine still had memories of enduring that experience. And so there was this acknowledgement that this had happened to Iranians. And so this fear actually persisted onwards. And so here, the prostitute becomes condemned as being unable to maintain her moral and bodily boundaries because she becomes the contact zone with these foreign forces. And therefore, by engaging with these foreign occupying forces, the prostitute was viewed as lacking physical and emotional boundaries and therefore betraying the nation state. And so this helped establish, again, Shahr-i as an unwanted district. Also within World War II, we had the Russian soldiers bringing in a Polish woman into Iran, and that resulted in foreign workers within Shahr-i contributing to the heterotopic nature of the citadel for its male clientele, as it encouraged Iranian men who desired foreign females to have easy access to them, and also for foreign occupying soldiers within the citadel to serve as a place for them to engage in commercial sex with Iranian women with no consequences. And so now we go into Shahr-i as a dystopia. So Shahr-i is essentially a state of exception because there is a sovereign power that exists, but at the same time, it does normalize the suspension of certain laws. And so this becomes a state in which there is the existence of like prostitution, violence, and killings. And so Shahr-i is a state of exception as the state practiced arbitrary governance within this district. And so sort of like to go into this state of this concept of the state of exception within as a dystopian perspective, there are narratives from Hakim Elahé in which he provides how like prostitutes lived within Shahr-i, and here he describes the death of Izzat and how someone actually used her body to commodify her because he ended up reading the Quran for her, but the reason that he was reading this for her was for him to gain the pity of passerbyers and to gain money from her. And so here we can see this dystopian aspect of Shahr-i in which the female body is commodified to the point that there is this disregard even for them on the brink of death. And so I also looked at Shahr-i as a dystopia from the perspective of like the prostitute, looking specifically at Kaveh Golestani's photos, and the ones that I focused on were these three because each of them showcased an element that made Shahr-i as a dystopia. For example, in the first one, we can see that we don't have roads that are pavemented and asphalted. And Hakim Elahé also talks about this within his book because he says that there's a lot of dust and there's a lot of dirt all around because of the movement that exists and because of the lack of water and electricity that exists within Shahr-i. The second one showcases sort of like the poor lodgings of these women and sort of like the state in which they lived in was quite grotesque, and they lived in like these garbage and filthy areas. And the final one is that how Shahr-i was exploited everyone, because we can see here that we have a woman with like a Peter Pan collar. We can assume that she's like within her early teenage years, and so we see how there is this exploitation of sort of like everyone, and so there isn't like that Shahr-i was essentially unkind to everyone within this district, and so we see how it establishes this idea of like a dystopia. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Very good. We are running out of time, but a couple of quick questions, please.
I just wanted to know what you thought about the sort of idea of courtesans, like in the Quadra report, as prostitutes, using that word, because I'm more familiar with the South Asian context, but to me, from what you've described, it seems like the sort of formalization of prostitution as an industry, like in the way that it would be familiar to us, is a result of Shahr-i as like a district being.
So I did also look at that. I just didn't have time to explain it. So it's important to acknowledge that the larger system, it itself was a patriarchal system that institutionalized these women within the act of prostitution. Because it'll be wrong for us to say that their lives were perfect. It was not, and it actually created this patriarchal system in which these men could have easy access to these women, and they also engaged in polygamy. And so it's important to distinguish that. But when we compare it to Shahr-i, we can see that their lives were much more prosperous than in the Qajar era than what it was within Shahr-i, because we see from like Zahra Khanum's diaries, she says that they lived a prosperous life. They even had properties outside of the royal residences, like given to them by the Shahs. For example, Nasruddin Shah gifted his wives like a lot of really expensive gifts. And so we can see that for them, the problem wasn't the matter of survival. It was the matter of like living their lives within the harems. But when we go into Shahr-i, we see that their lives shifts into this idea of like, it becomes a matter of surviving. And that's how we see. And I think it's an important thing to distinguish that they're both patriarchal institutions, but they end up sort of like exploiting women differently. But I feel like there's in two very bad options, there's one better than the other.
Please.
Sorry, I didn't get one part of your presentation. What's the relationship between eliminating Sarok and expanding prostitution in Syria among the middle class?
Yes, so Reza Shah saw that Reza Shah saw that the harems were anti-modern. They went against this idea of the state that he wanted to establish. And so what ended up happening is that with the decline of the Qajar era, we have an increase in prostitution. This happens because he eliminates the harems and he cuts their pensions. So that was their only financial source of income. And so without that financial source of income, these women, some of them ended up marrying like wealthy, prosperous men, but most of them ended up in Shahr-i, and because they had no other choice, they began to engage in prostitution, and that results in the establishment of Shahr-i.
All right. Thank you very much. Awesome. Well done. We now have a break for about 20 minutes. There is some food that was just delivered.
308.
Yeah.
I can walk over to 3.
Okay. In room
308.
308.
Yeah.
And please have something to eat.